A doctor was working at a hospital where the patients were tagged with colored bands. Green marked alive. Red indicated deceased. One night, the doctor was instructed to get a few supplies from the basement of the hospital, and so he headed to the lift. The lift doors opened, and there was a patient inside, minding her own business. Patients were allowed to roam around the hospital to stretch, especially those who had stayed long. The rule was to be back in their rooms before 10. The doctor smiled at the patient before pressing the number for the basement. He found it unusual that the woman didn't have a button already pressed. He wondered if she was heading to the basement too. The lift finally reached the floor where the doors opened. In the distance, a man was limping towards the elevator, and in a panic, the doctor slammed the elevator button and willed it to close. It finally did, and the lift began to ascend back up, the doctor's heart pounding. "Why did you do that?" "He was trying to use the lift," the woman said, clearly annoyed. "Did you see his wrist?" the doctor asked. "It was red. He died last night." "I would know because I did his surgery." The woman lifted her wrist. He saw red. She smiled. "Like this one?" A hiker decided to go on a hike by himself, something he was not very used to doing. The whole day passed normally. Trees and bushes engulfed his surroundings. He enjoyed being outdoors in the mountains. Nothing seemed strange to him. That was until he was making his way back to his car. He figured an 8-hour hike was good enough. The sky was already getting dark, and he needed to get back pretty quickly. What was odd was how much he didn't recognize the trail back. He began to panic. Night had already taken over, and all he had was a flashlight and no clue on how to get back. He knew it was already far too late and too dangerous to keep going through the perilous forest. He began to worry that he would have no shelter for the night, when by a stroke of luck, he stumbled across a broken-down cabin. It was dark and seemed like no one had visited it in years, but he knew it was the only place where he could rest until daylight, especially since his flashlight was running out of battery. He knocked on the door a few times, but no one answered, so he let himself in. Strangely enough, a perfect bed fitted for one person awaited him in the center of the room. He knew that if the owner came back, he could explain himself. He was sure that the owner wouldn't mind, or was even possibly dead. So he went ahead and got himself comfortable in bed. As he tried to sleep, he couldn't ignore the collection of paintings around the room, portraits of strange-looking people, all peering at him, each wearing a smile that sent chills up his spine. Not too long after, his exhaustion from the hike got the best of him, and he was able to ignore the faces. The next morning, he got up early and was shocked to see that there were no paintings around the room, but windows. And only windows. He looked outside, and the same faces from the previous night stared back at him, each wearing the same smiles. I bought a new house in the small town of Winthrop. The house was cheap, but the most important part was that I needed to get away from the city. A few months ago, I had a run-in with a stalker. While I had managed to get him arrested, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes just constantly watching me. I felt like there were eyes everywhere, at home and on the streets, so I decided to move out into the country to somewhere with less people, just for my peace of mind. The house itself was big and somewhat old, but otherwise very welcoming. The agent who introduced me to the house had been required to mention that a serial killer had lived here in the past, which was why the house was so cheap. However, he and later my next-door neighbor Sarah both told me to pay the thought no mind. 4 other owners had lived in the house since then, and all of them were very happy with it. I loved the house. Its interior furnishings were beautiful and very comfortable. The people of Winthrop were friendly, often bringing over freshly baked pastries or inviting me over for dinner. Yet, after a week, I stopped loving it. The feeling of someone watching returned, worse than before. I tried to ignore it, but soon I started losing sleep. Giant bags grew under my eyes, and I began yawning almost as much as I breathed. Sarah was kind enough to let me stay in her house for a few nights. It was during this time that I heard the legend of Forrest Carter, the serial killer who had lived in my house. While no one knows his exact kill count, Carter, also known as the Winthrop Peacock, was a man with an extremely severe case of narcissism. Legends say that he couldn't fall asleep if he didn't feel like he was being watched. He was finally arrested for putting up a scarecrow to watch him during the night. Only it wasn't a scarecrow. Carter had murdered a 17-year-old girl just so her corpse could stare at him. The story gave me shivers, and after I went home, I felt like there were hundreds of pairs of eyes just watching me no matter how I turned. Today, however, was the first day that I acted out. I was cooking breakfast when I felt the eyes. Instinctively, out of fear, I threw my kitchen knife, which lodged itself into the wall. As I pulled it out, I found myself staring at a pair of eyes, pickling in formaldehyde. I've been watching the police peel away the drywall of my house for hours now. So far, they found 142 pairs of eyes in little glass jars. The scariest thing is, each and every one was staring at me,